She was Susan Boyle from her village in Scotland, who not many people knew, and now she's one of the most famous people in the world.
She was just a simple woman from a small town with a big dream tucked away in her heart. Then one night, she walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, and the whole world stopped to listen. Everything felt magical, and everyone loved her. But as the years went by, something quietly changed. Life was not always as bright as that one beautiful night, and slowly, the Susan Boyle the world knew began to look very different. What happened to her along the way? And who is she today at 65? This is the extraordinary true story of Susan Boyle, the woman who proved that it is never, ever too late to be heard. Born into struggle, Susan Boyle came into the world on 1st April 1961 in the small Scottish town of Blackburn, West Lothian. She was the youngest of 10 children, born into a working-class family where money was tight and life was simple. The house was always full of noise, full of people, and full of the kind of love that does not need to say much to be felt. Her father, Patrick, was a World War II veteran who worked hard in the mines and carried the weight of that quietly. Her mother, Bridget, was warm and steady, a piano player and shorthand typist who kept the family grounded. The kind of woman who held everything together without making a fuss about it. From the very beginning, though, Susan was different to her siblings. During her birth, something went wrong, and a lack of oxygen reached her brain in those first important moments. Doctors noticed early on that Susan was not developing quite like other children. She struggled in ways that were hard to explain, and the answers were slow to come. But her mother noticed something else long before the doctors did. When music played in that small family home, Susan changed completely. She went still and calm, listening with her whole self, as if the music was saying something that words never quite could. She was a quiet little girl with a big and complicated world inside her, growing up in a busy house, on an ordinary street, in a town the rest of the world had never heard of. Nobody around her had any idea what she was quietly carrying inside, and nobody could have guessed what she would one day do with it. But the road ahead of young Susan was going to be much harder than anyone expected. Health struggles and misdiagnosis. Growing up, Susan's body and mind worked differently to those around her. She experienced seizures and convulsions from a young age, episodes that frightened her family and left doctors scratching their heads, unsure of what they were really dealing with. For a long time, the answer they settled on was ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, alongside a possible epilepsy diagnosis. These labels followed Susan through her childhood, shaping how teachers treated her, how other children saw her, and slowly, how Susan began to see herself. The problem was that the diagnoses were not quite right. What Susan was actually living with was the lasting result of that oxygen deprivation at birth, something that affected how she processed the world around her, how she communicated, how she reacted, and how she connected with other people. She was not unwell in the way her doctors thought. She was simply wired a little differently, and the world around her had not yet found a way to understand that. Because nobody had the full picture, nobody really knew how to help her properly. Teachers did their best with what little information they had, and Susan herself had no real way of putting into words what she was going through, because she barely understood it herself. She just knew that things felt harder for her than they seemed to be for everyone else, and she carried that as quietly as she could, finding her comfort in music. It would not be until much later in her life that Susan would finally receive a diagnosis that actually explained so much of what she had been carrying all along. But before any of that clarity came, life outside the home was about to get a great deal harder. Bullying, abuse, and family pressure. School was not a kind place for Susan. From early on, other children noticed that she was different, and children can be very unkind about different. They teased her about her appearance, mocked the way she spoke, made fun of her behavior, and shut her out of the groups and friendships that most children take for granted. It was not something that happened once or twice. It was a regular part of her school day, and she simply had to find a way to get through it. Some of the adults around her did not make things easier either. In those days, the belt was still used as punishment in Scottish schools, and Susan, whose behavior was often a result of her undiagnosed condition, found herself on the receiving end of it. She was being disciplined for something she could not fully control by people who did not yet understand what was really going on with her. At home, life had its own complications. Her father was a tough man, shaped by war and hard work, and his moods could shift in ways that kept the household on edge. Her mother loved Susan deeply and sincerely, but that love sometimes meant wrapping her in too much protection, making it harder for Susan to develop the kind of independence she would eventually need. Susan grew up feeling a little out of place in most of the spaces she moved through, at school, at home, and in the world generally. She kept her feelings close, found comfort in music wherever she could, and quietly got on with the business of growing up, even when growing up felt like more than she should have to handle alone. As Susan moved into adulthood, she would carry all of this with her, hoping that things might finally get a little easier. Love, control, and music as escape. By the time Susan reached her mid-20s, she had grown into a quiet and private young woman, someone who kept mostly to herself and found more comfort in music than in people. Life in Blackburn moved slowly, and Susan moved through it gently, not asking for too much and not expecting too much either. Then she met someone. A local man named John came into her life, and for a while things felt a little warmer and a little brighter. It was nothing dramatic or complicated, just a simple and quiet connection, the kind that makes ordinary days feel a little less ordinary. For Susan, who had spent so much of her life feeling on the outside of things, it mattered enormously. But her parents were not comfortable with it. They felt Susan was not ready, that she lacked the independence needed to manage a relationship well, and they stepped in and brought it to an end. They meant well, they always did, but the result for Susan was a quiet kind of heartbreak that she carried alone, the way she had learned to carry most things. Music filled the space that was left behind. She sang at her local church, where people knew her voice and appreciated it, and she spent long hours at home singing along to records she loved, losing herself completely in the words and the melodies. It was the one part of her life that felt entirely and safely her own, and she held on to it tightly. But Susan was not content to keep that voice to herself forever. Susan had always believed, quietly and privately, that her voice was something worth sharing. So she began doing something about it, entering local talent competitions, standing on small stages, and singing with everything she had, hoping that someone out there would finally stop and listen. In 1995, she got what felt like a genuine opportunity. She appeared on a television show called My Kind of People, hosted by entertainer Michael Barrymore, and performed a song called I Don't Know How to Love Him. She gave it everything she had, but the audience laughed, not at her voice, but at her, at the way she looked and carried herself. It was a public and painful moment that stayed with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. She did not stop, though. In 1998, she recorded a set of demo tapes singing Killing Me Softly, Cry Me a River, and Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, songs she loved and performed with genuine feeling. She packaged them up carefully and sent them off to record labels and television companies, along with all the hope she could spare. The rejections came back one by one, quiet and steady, like a door being gently but firmly closed in her face, over and over again, and she had spent her own savings on it. She kept trying, year after year, without much encouragement, driven by something deep inside her that simply refused to let the dream go. But Susan Boyle was about to walk into an audition that would change absolutely everything. The Britain's Got Talent audition. On 11th April 2009, Susan Boyle walked into an audition that would change her life forever. She was 47 years old, dressed simply, her dark curly hair unstyled, her clothes ordinary, carrying nothing but herself and the dream she had been holding onto for decades. The venue was large, and the audience was packed. The judges sat at their table, ready and watching. When Susan walked out onto that stage, the reaction was immediate. People in the audience exchanged glances and quiet smiles, assuming, before she had even opened her mouth, that this was not going to be very good. She told the judges her dream was to become a professional singer, as successful as Elaine Paige. A few people laughed. Simon Cowell raised an eyebrow. The atmosphere in that room was not unkind exactly, but it was doubtful, and Susan could feel every bit of it. Then she began to sing. The song was "I Dreamed a Dream" from the musical Les Miserables, and from the very first note, something shifted in that room. The laughter stopped. The smiles faded. People sat forward in their seats, eyes wide, completely caught off guard by the voice coming out of this quiet, unassuming woman from a village nobody had heard of. The audience rose to their feet before the song was even finished. The judges were visibly stunned, Simon Cowell among them. By the time the last note landed, the room was on its feet, and the applause was thunderous. Within days, the video was watched by millions of people all over the world, shared from screen to screen by people who simply could not believe what they were hearing. But overnight, fame is not always as wonderful as it looks from the outside. Everything moved very fast after that audition. Within weeks, Susan Boyle was one of the most recognized faces on the planet, her name appearing in newspapers, on television screens, and across the internet, in languages she could not even read. For a woman who had spent her whole life being overlooked, it was an enormous and overwhelming change. Her debut album, I Dreamed a Dream, was released later that same year in 2009, and the response was unlike anything the music industry had seen in a very long time. It went straight to #1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States, becoming the fastest-selling debut album in British chart history. It reached the top spot in more than 21 countries and eventually sold over 9 million copies worldwide, earning Susan around $5 million in a matter of months. The little-known woman from Blackburn had become a genuine global phenomenon, and the world could not get enough of her. But behind the headlines and the record-breaking numbers, Susan was struggling. She had spent almost 50 years living a quiet and private life, and nothing had prepared her for the intensity of what fame actually felt like up close. The cameras, the interviews, the constant public attention, and the pressure to perform and deliver and smile on demand were more than she had bargained for. It all became too much. Susan was hospitalized for exhaustion and emotional stress not long after her Britain's Got Talent appearance, a reminder that the woman behind the voice was still very human, still very vulnerable, and still finding her way through a world that had changed around her almost overnight. But the pressures of fame were only a part of what Susan was dealing with behind closed doors. Her private problems were slowly becoming overwhelming. Family strain, safety fears, and isolation. Fame brought Susan many things she had always dreamed of, but it also brought complications she had never anticipated. One of the most painful came from close to home. Her brother Gary had lent her £75,000 during the difficult years before her breakthrough, money that had helped her keep going when things were hard. But once the fame arrived and the money started coming in, the question of that loan became a source of real tension between them. Accusations were made, feelings were hurt, and the relationship that had existed between siblings who had grown up in the same small house became strained in ways that were difficult to repair. Outside the family, Susan was also dealing with something more unsettling. Her home in Blackburn was broken into, leaving her feeling unsafe in the one place that had always been her constant, the house she had grown up in, the street she had always known. While she was away performing in Liverpool, intruders accessed her hotel, adding to a growing sense that her private world was no longer private at all. For someone who had always valued quietness and routine, these intrusions were deeply unsettling. The anxiety built slowly and steadily, sitting beneath the surface of all the public smiling and performing, a private weight that very few people around her fully understood. Susan had spent her whole life longing to be seen and heard. But the reality of being seen by the entire world was something very different to the dream she had carried in that small house in Blackburn, singing alone into empty rooms. And through all of this, Susan's body was quietly going through changes of its own. Over the years that followed her breakthrough, people who watched Susan closely began to notice that she looked different. Her appearance had changed gradually, and for a woman who had become famous almost overnight, those changes attracted a great deal of public attention and comment. In 2009, when the world first saw her, Susan had dark curly hair worn naturally, minimal makeup, simple clothing, and the kind of warm, unpolished look of someone who had never thought too much about how they appeared on camera. She was nervous on stage, shy in interviews, and entirely unguarded in a way that people found genuinely refreshing. By 2024 and beyond, she looked noticeably more polished. Her hair was lighter, styled into a neat and tidy bob, her clothing more carefully chosen, her makeup more considered. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that had not always been there before. But the changes were not simply cosmetic. Life had been genuinely hard on Susan's body during those years. In 2012, she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which led to real changes in her diet and her approach to exercise. Later, she finally received the diagnosis that made sense of so much of her childhood: Asperger's syndrome, replacing the earlier misdiagnoses that had followed her for decades and giving her, at last, a real understanding of herself. Then, in 2022, Susan suffered a stroke, an event that affected both her speech and her movement, and brought her public life to a temporary stop. She spent 2023 focused on recovery and rehabilitation, working quietly and patiently to find her way back to the music she had always loved. And she did find her way back in a moment that moved the world all over again. Comeback, loss, recognition, and legacy. In 2023, Susan Boyle walked back onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, the same stage where everything had changed for her 14 years earlier. She had been through a stroke, months of rehabilitation, personal loss, and more quiet struggle than most people would ever know about. But she stood there, composed and smiling, and she sang, and the audience loved her all over again. It was a moment that meant everything. Along the way, Susan had collected recognition that would have seemed impossible to the bullied little girl from Blackburn: a World Music Award, a Billboard Award, entries in the Guinness World Records for the fastest-selling debut album in the United Kingdom, and for being the oldest artist to reach #1 with a debut record. In 2012, she received an OBE, one of the highest honors the British establishment can give. Over her career, she has sold more than 25 million albums, across more than 120 certifications worldwide. But Susan has also known real loss. Her mother, Bridget, the woman who first sat her down at a piano and showed her what music could feel like, passed away in 2007, just before Susan found her moment. Her sister Bertie followed in 2015. She has spoken openly about loneliness, about her wish for children of her own, about the parts of life that fame simply cannot fill. Susan Boyle is not just a singer. She is proof, warm and real and undeniable, that it is never too late, and that the most extraordinary stories sometimes come from the quietest places. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.